Hello, and thank you so much for listening to the Impostor Syndrome Files. Rather than release new episodes during these busy holiday weeks, I'm sharing some old favorites. So, in case you missed it the first time around or you want to check it out again, I hope you enjoy this replay. And please share it with your friends, colleagues, or anyone else that you think might benefit from the conversation. Thanks again, and happy holidays. Do you tend to think and feel more deeply than those around you? Do you also put a lot of pressure on yourself to set goals and succeed? If so, you are what my guest this week, Melody Wilding, calls a sensitive striver. And that unique combination of thinking and feeling deeply while being driven by the need to achieve makes us more susceptible to self-doubt and imposter syndrome. In this conversation, we talk about how sensitive strivers can more confidently set boundaries, better manage worry and overthinking, and address perfectionism so that we can better trust ourselves and achieve success on our own terms. Thank you so much, as always, for listening. Welcome to the Impostor Syndrome Files. My name is Kim Meninger, and as an executive coach and former high-tech leader, my personal mission is to help professionals overcome imposter syndrome so that you can advance your career with confidence. Each week, I interview a new guest who brings a powerful perspective to this conversation, including personal stories, best practices, and new insights. The more we talk about this issue, the more we destigmatize imposter syndrome, recognize that we're not alone, and empower ourselves to access the tools and resources that can help us and those around us. Thank you so much for listening and for sharing with others you think would benefit from this conversation. So welcome back, Melody. It is so exciting to see you again. I think it's been a couple of years now. Gosh, it's hard to, time goes by so fast, but I'm excited to continue our conversation. And before we do, I would love to invite you to just tell us a little bit more about you.
Well, I'm thrilled to be here again. And I feel like since the pandemic, time is a very strange concept. I don't know, sometimes when it's been a few months that's passed or a few years, it surprised me every time. So thank you for having me back, Kim. I'm really happy to be here. And I am Melody Wilding. I am an executive coach. I'm a licensed social worker. And my specialty is really working with people who I call sensitive strivers. So people that are highly sensitive, they think and feel everything more deeply, but they're also high achievers. They put a lot of pressure on themselves to succeed and set a lot of goals for themselves, are very driven. And those two qualities, when they come together, can make you more susceptible to self-doubt and imposter syndrome.
Yeah, I love the way you describe that, because I think that probably resonates with the vast majority of people who are listening to this podcast. And I know you wrote a book recently, and I think that was right around the time that you and I spoke the first time. And I'm curious, has anything sort of changed for you and how you're thinking about the challenges that we're talking about? Any new developments since the book came out? Any surprises, any reactions that you've sort of incorporated into your thinking?
It's so interesting. The book just celebrated 2 years that it's been out, its second birthday, which is very exciting. And, I've learned a few things. First, I'll share some of the key lessons that I think keep coming up again and again. And one of those is that you teach people how to treat you. And, people will take cues from how you treat yourself. So if you are always questioning the value you bring to the table, if you are never, sticking to your boundaries, you're always allowing people to book overtime slots you have, people take cues from that, right? And so I think that is a big one. Another one that stands out to me, and this is a lesson I learn again and again and again, is that confidence is a byproduct of taking action. It's so easy to convince yourself that I just need to feel ready, just need to take a few more courses, get a little more practice under my belt. And sure, all of those things are good, but you will never feel 100% ready. And you have to act anyway, because that is what gives you the feeling of confidence. So Courage comes first, confidence comes second, and then competence comes third.
I'm so glad you said that because you're absolutely right. I often joke, when was the last time you got out of bed one day and said, okay, finally ready to do that scary thing I've been putting off, right? It just doesn't happen that way. The confidence follows the action. So that's such a great point. And I really want to go back to this idea of teaching people how to treat you, because I think this is such a tough one for so many of us, myself included, when it comes to boundary setting. In theory, it sounds very reasonable. In practice, it feels almost, depending on the relationship, depending on the situation, like you're being difficult in some way. I think for so many women, especially women who are feeling like they want to be seen as team players, they want to be seen as adding value, the idea of saying no to someone or the idea of saying no to something feels antithetical to how they think and how they behave. And so I'm curious if we could spend some time talking a little bit more about boundaries, why they're so hard to set, and do we just need to accept that it's going to be hard and do it anyway, or are there ways that we can make it easier?
A little bit of both and there. So to your point about socialization, yes, women, we are brought up from a young age being told, play nice, that you need to be likable and agreeable in order to succeed. And that conditioning follows us over into our careers. And then, of course, you layer on more of this collaborative, team-oriented culture, which is wonderful. But when all of these things come together, our best intentions can then be taken to an extreme and start to hurt us. And I was speaking to a women's ERG yesterday, and so many of them were saying, I feel like I'm in this double bind, that I want to advance, but I feel like I have to do 3 different jobs. I have to take on and say yes and really do another job before I get promoted to it. And it's this catch-22. So I think having struggles around boundaries is so common. Also, we're never taught how to do it. We're not really taught how to say no. We're taught from a very young age, say yes to every opportunity that comes your way, right? Seize the moment. And again, all of that is great, but you get to a certain point in your career where, as the saying goes, what got you here is not going to get you there.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point too. And I think there's almost a difference between when you set a boundary early in a relationship. And so I talk with people about this all the time when they're starting a new job, because there's a clean slate, right? Nobody knows you yet. You can set those expectations early and people will be more likely to go along with them, versus trying to redefine a boundary later, once people have gotten used to being able to email you at all hours of the day and night and get an immediate response, right? So are there ways that we can renegotiate the terms of some of these relationships once we realize this isn't working for me?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's never too late to ask for a do-over or a reset. And one of my favorite strategies to do that is creating a me manual. So creating a guide to you as a professional. And that includes things about the best ways to communicate with you, your working hours, how you learn best, how you like to receive feedback best. And it's really helpful for defining some of those expectations, like you were saying. And I think with boundaries, we need to reframe it from, this is a purely selfish thing I'm doing for myself, to my boundary can actually serve other people. When there is clarity, when there is more certainty, everyone benefits. So if someone has more certainty about, oh, here's how I can get the best out of Kim, or if I give her feedback in this way, I know she's going to receive it best. That's good for everyone involved. And for your own benefit, I see time and time again that when people fill out this me manual, and it doesn't have to be, extravagant. This can be a Google Doc. It can be a simple slide deck. You don't have to, go perfectionistic with it. But it never fails that when people share it with their boss or their coworkers, that those other people will say, this is great. Can we use this for the rest of the team? And it's wonderful because then it takes also some of the second guessing out of other people's behavior. If someone is short with you, I know for me, when someone is very concise in their communication, I usually read into that and think, oh, they're angry with me. I did something wrong. But if you know the other person is more of just a curt communicator, then it takes some of that personalization out of it.
Yes, I am always talking about this in terms of giving people the answers to the test, right? Because if we don't have the information, we will make it up. And oftentimes we make it up in ways that are not favorable to ourselves or to the other person, just as you're describing. My first assumption is never, oh, they have a different communication style than I do, right? It's always, wow, that person's rude, or, oh my gosh, what did I do wrong? Right? So anything that we can do to create that kind of clarity and transparency around each other and how we interact together is such a great way to alleviate some of the stress that comes into our work. And I love what you're saying too about how my setting a boundary can actually serve you. And I think about this as an opportunity for teams as well, because it might feel funny if I'm the only one who's now coming forward and saying, okay, I have new boundaries that I want to make you all aware of, even though we would never say it in those terms. If we can recognize that every single one of us struggles with this, then there's an opportunity for us to collectively come together, whether it's in the form of the document that you just said, which sort of makes it more of a process and less of an emotional activity, or to even just kind of say, hey, you know what kinds of, whether you use the word boundaries or not, would make it easier for you to do your job. And then we can all share. And now if I know, you know what, calling you after 5 p.m. is just not going to work because you have kids that you're taking care of, I'm not going to do that and put myself in a position of getting a frustrated reaction from you or interfering with your evening routine. So I just love what you're saying about making it easier for everybody to understand each other and show up in support of each other.
Absolutely. Yeah. And to your point about, doing this at any time, I like to say to look for natural transition points. So you might say, as we look toward the beginning of this next quarter, something I'm focusing on is streamlining our communication. In an effort to help with that, I would like to make a simple request for XYZ. Or in an effort to help with that, I've prepared this document that's going to help us work together in the best way possible. So whenever you can frame your boundary in terms of what's in it for the other person, what's in it for me, classic, then you increase your chances that it's going to be received better.
Yeah. And one thing I'm curious about from your perspective too, and this may segue us into another segment of this conversation that I'm interested in, but we get so attached to other people's responses. And let's just imagine that there is somebody who's just not happy about a boundary that we set. They just aren't happy about it. How do we get to a place where we take that less personally, perhaps reframe it as more so information about them, not information about us, right? Because I think so much of what we're talking about too is a function of how you described our early socialization and this need to just make everyone happy. We just want people to like us. We want to please everybody around us. And if in our quest to set these boundaries, we bump into somebody who's really resistant, what do we do with that?
Mm-hmm. It's very common and it's normal. I think that is a key mindset shift, is to realize that's expected. Because when you start setting boundaries, especially if you've been someone who's overly accommodating, people are used to you responding in that manner. And when you start changing your behavior, you're upsetting the apple cart a little bit. You're upsetting the equilibrium of the social system, and it's going to try to bring itself back into balance. And so that's very common. It's just like if you start going to the gym all the time or something, and people in your life start criticizing you for that, or you start working on your personal development and people start criticizing you for that. It's very similar here. So the status quo will always try to draw you back to center. So I think the first thing is to expect it, that the pushback is normal, be ready for it. And this is where assertiveness comes in, that when you receive that negative response, you need to stand your ground and you need to reiterate your perspective. You may need to say, that's not possible. I'm not able to do that. Or thank you again for thinking of me. I can't participate this time. You need to reiterate that. You might also say, I hear this is important, and what I'm asking is important to me too. So I ask that you respect my request on this. Standing your ground, very important. I think another tool that is very underestimated is silence. And that's because as people pleasers, when we struggle with imposter syndrome, we feel a bit insecure. And so we may over-explain our boundary or over-justify it, which is a mistake because it opens us up to objection handling. Someone can poke holes and say, oh no, well, we can change things around so you can do X, Y, Z. Or we throw ourselves under the bus. We set a boundary and then we undermine it by saying, if you really don't have time, or this is really too much of a request, don't worry about it. It's not a big deal. Right. And so deliver your boundary and be quiet. And if someone else is getting worked up in the face of your boundary, silence is a really great way to take some of the energy and the intensity out of that reaction. It's the same psychology, if you have children, it's why you don't respond to a temper tantrum. It's the same sort of psychology working there.
That's a great tip. And it's certainly one that I think we can practice, because it is hard in the moment. We triggered, and depending on our fight or flight response, right, we might have trouble staying disciplined enough to stay quiet. Or to your point, if you're a people pleaser, you might just jump right in. But I think that's a really great strategy. And the good news and the bad news about boundaries is that they show up, or have the potential to show up, in every aspect of our lives. And so we can practice these outside of the workplace too. And that might make it feel a little bit more comfortable. If you're struggling with setting a boundary with your boss, maybe you practice setting a boundary with your friends first.
Absolutely. Start small, build your confidence, right? In less high stakes situation. I always say the first time you practice the skill should not be when you enter the boardroom or you enter that high stakes situation. You want to go back to taking action is what will build your confidence. You know that you can do this. You know that you'll be okay and you won't die. And that's important. That's important to build trust in yourself. And Kim, if I may, you mentioned, boundaries show up everywhere. And I think one way that we don't talk about boundaries enough are internal boundaries. So we talk a lot about external boundaries, how we protect our time and our energy and our physical space. But what we don't talk about, and for most of us with imposter syndrome is equally as important, is the mental and emotional limits. How much space do we allow someone's comment or feedback to take up in our brain? How long do we allow ourselves to think about work after hours? And those I think they're much harder because they're intangible, right?
I'm so glad you brought that up, because I was thinking about that too, especially because of the sensitive part of the sensitive striver, right? So I get this question a lot, and it's not easy. There's no simple solution to this unless you have it, in which case, please share. But I think, like you're saying, it's one thing to say, I'm not going to check my email after 6 p.m. and I can keep my phone in the other room. And as difficult as it may be sometimes to resist the temptation, for the most part, I can figure that out. But how do I shut my brain off? And that's what people tend to struggle with is, I don't want to do that. I'd love to set a boundary around my rumination and all my constant worrying, but I don't know how. And so I'm curious what your thoughts are in terms of entry level kinds of strategies for that, because I know there's a whole spectrum of solutions that we might take advantage of. But are there anything starter kinds of strategies that you would recommend?
Well, yeah, to your point, I wish there was an easy button that would make life a whole lot easier. But yeah, in terms of starter strategies, I think it's important to recognize that our brains are problem solving machines. So if there is a question or an open loop in our head, our mind is just going to turn over and over and over again trying to solve it. And so getting those thoughts and those concerns out of your head and putting them somewhere else is really key. Whether a lot of my clients have had success with creating worry time, where they, set aside 20 minutes a week, and that is their compartmentalized time to worry. If anything comes up during the rest of the week, it's sort of a mental note or literally writing it down that I'll address this, I'll tackle this during my worry time. And lo and behold, most things just seem to resolve themselves and not be a big deal. So that's a useful one. With a lot of people, I find that also parsing out feedback can be really helpful. So writing down exactly what was said, what was someone's exact words or phrasing, what is everything that is wrong with the feedback, all their biases and blind spots and things they got wrong and things you're angry at. Then what is right or might be right with the feedback? Is there a nugget that's useful in there? And sometimes by doing this, you realize there's nothing that's really useful, and that's really good to know too. And then also, what are you going to do about it afterwards? So what action do you take now? Do you walk around the block to disconnect? Do you apologize or make some sort of a change to your workflow? It could be anything, but the point here is to get those things out of your head so they're not rattling around and your brain's not trying to close the loop and solve all of those questions.
I wrote down what you said about it being a problem solving. Did you call it an engine or, it's machine? Yes, because that is exactly how I think about it. I often think it just, as someone who has had a lifelong anxiety disorder and is very prone to rumination and catastrophizing, I have learned to reframe what's happening as my brain trying to do me a favor, right? My brain is trying to help me. It doesn't want me to experience this kind of pain again. So it's trying to, like you said, solve this problem so that we can prevent this from ever happening. I think just knowing that, just naming it that is so powerful, because it allows you to recognize what's happening, to see the value of it, as sort of warped as that might sound. And then to your point, to be able to follow that up with an action step that essentially tells your brain, okay, this is accounted for, right? Like, yes. Lesson learned, right? We can move on. And so even something as simple as you talked about the worry time, sometimes my brain will just, it thinks it's doing me a favor by keeping something that I need to do in short-term memory, thinking like, oh, I'm going to forget if I don't keep doing this. So if I just put it on my calendar of this is when I'm going to do it, it's like, oh, okay, great. You've got it covered. I don't need to worry about it anymore. So even though some of the action steps that we may be talking about feel like, who has time for that? Or that sounds so cliche. They really do work. There is a reason why getting it out of your head, putting it down, is an effective strategy.
Well, I love what you said about reframing the purpose, because that gives us more compassion for what's happening too. Because what's worse is when it's called shooting the second arrow, where you judge yourself for the thing you're doing. You make yourself worse. You intensify your pain and your suffering around it by beating yourself up for ruminating, for example. Why do I always do this? Why can't I get over this? Other people don't have this problem. And that makes it so much worse, rather than saying, this is my brain trying to keep me safe and help me. It totally changes the tone.
Yes. It's been a work in progress for me over the course of my adult life, but it really does make a difference. I'm curious too, as we're talking about some of the overthinking, some of the worrying, if we can pull in the achievement piece of what we're talking about, because there's a difference between wanting to set high standards for yourself and wanting to achieve, and perfectionism and feeling like nothing you do is ever good enough. And I think achievers sometimes struggle to differentiate between those two things. And I think there's, certainly multiple factors that contribute to this. We have a tendency to compare ourselves to others and think I'm not doing as much as that person's doing, or the proverbial ladder, right? Like I should be further along that ladder at this stage of my career, and so I must be doing it wrong. And even the things that we are doing well, we're constantly criticizing. And so I'm curious what your thoughts are on how do we maintain the benefits of being an achiever, of really liking the challenge and wanting to continue to contribute in positive ways, while tempering some of the negative energy and the ways in which we get in our own way in the course of trying to reach those goals.
Yeah. And I want to underscore the fact that I think a theme that's coming out of this conversation is that any strength taken to an extreme can become a hindrance, right? And so what I think both you and I are advocating for is balance here, that we don't want to lose these qualities, but we have to make sure that we're not using them in excess to the point where they hurt us or other people around us even. So when it comes to achievement, you were mentioning what I would call a lot of push motivation. I should do something. I have to do this. It's really doing something out of a sense of obligation because you want to avoid rejection or ridicule or judgment from somebody else. And so it's all of those shoulds, have to, ought to. It's all of that sort of, where is your intention coming from? Now compare that to pull motivation. So that's something you feel naturally pulled to. Yes, it may be scary or daunting, but there's excitement about it. And you feel like my gut is telling me to move towards this thing, even though I know it might be difficult. So it feels more like an organic, pure motivation. And so I think really taking stock for yourself of how much of your life and your time is really now spent in that push motivation, how much of your achievement is motivated by that versus how much is motivated by more of a pull.
Yeah. And that's a really important, I would say, a really important thing that we don't spend a lot of time thinking about, because so much of how we show up is a function of our internal programming. Maybe we had parents who told us, you need to work hard, and, whatever the early messages are, or again, that social comparison, the societal influences of everybody wants to get ahead. And so we just are on a path that we didn't choose, thinking that we need to get as far along that as possible. And so I wonder if, and I'm kind of thinking out loud here, but there are some people who may be able to, in the context of what they're doing now, flip from a push to a pull motivation to maybe really just kind of think about my core values and why I want what I'm doing and use that as a motivation. But then there are other people who just aren't in the right place. And maybe they're just coming to realize that I've been going down this road. I've been following someone else's vision of success. I've been doing this because I thought this was what I should be doing, but I really don't want to. Do you have thoughts on how to distinguish between those two? Because I think sometimes we reach a point where we think, okay, I just need to escape from the situation that I'm in, or over commit to the wrong path, because we make assumptions about what is or is not possible. And so sorting out, how much of what of the stress or the pain that we're feeling right now is a function of something that is manageable, or that we can change within the current situation, and how much of it is just we need to remove ourselves from this situation.
Yeah, this is it's such a good question. It's such a big
I know.
question. No, it's a great one. And the first thing that comes to mind for me is you take yourself everywhere. So you need to make sure that I always like to ask, do you feel you have done your best addressing the situation? Have you done what is within your power to change and still not seeing results? Because sometimes we do have to take ownership for how we may be complicit in creating certain conditions that we don't like. Like I said, you teach people how to treat you. So if you are not being assertive, you're not speaking up about your needs, you're not sharing your wins and advocating for yourself, sure, you may not feel like you're valued or you're in the right place. But if you have done those things and you are still not seeing results, then it's probably time to make a change. But you want to make sure that you have tackled some of those internal causes because that may just follow you into the next role. And so you want to make sure you're running towards something and not necessarily always just running away and trying to escape a situation.
Yes. I could not agree with you more. I think that it's probably worthwhile to reflect on multiple experiences over time and see any patterns or themes that emerge, because it is likely that if you're struggling with boundaries in one role, you probably struggled with them in another role. And if you haven't gotten that to a place that works for you, you're going to take that with you wherever you go next. And I tend to think of it too as, once you come to that place of realization, if you do conclude where I am today is just not the right place for me and I want to take a next step forward, what better time than to use where you are today to address some of those challenges and get that work done? Because what have you got to lose, right? You've already decided, I'm not going to stay here. You're in a place where at least it's familiar. To try to go someplace new and do the work at the same time is going to create a lot more stress and overwhelm. So take advantage of the time where you are to do that work and prepare yourself so you have it with you when you go.
Exactly. Yeah. And what I see often happen is that we get caught in analysis paralysis and overthinking. So I can't tell you how many times people will say, I've done all of the personality quizzes. I've done all of the what career should you be in quizzes, and I don't feel like I'm any closer to having clarity on what I should do next. And that's because self-reflection only goes so far. There comes a point where you have to make a hypothesis about, I may be interested in this new industry. And you have to get out there and test it and get actual data and see how it feels. And so I would say, if you feel like you have that inkling or that nudge, make a hypothesis, take a guess at what you think you might enjoy or the type of environment you want to be in, and get that data. Can you do informational interviews with people? Can you take on a side project or work with a different team, for example? What can you do to get that information to prove or disprove and continue moving forward?
And what I love about framing it as a hypothesis is that it's naturally more of an experiment, and it's not this huge make or break life decision, which is often what we tell ourselves when we're trying to evaluate a change. And so there's so much emotional pressure baked into that analysis, that kind of a decision-making process. Whereas if you think of it as, like you said, like, oh, I'm just going to explore this question. I'm going to come from a place of curiosity. I'm not going to get attached to the outcome. I'm just going to see what happens, collect the data, and then make a decision. It's a different experience for us.
Exactly.
Yeah. And especially, again, for those of us who over worry and overthink everything. Is there anything else that you think about all the time that we haven't covered?
Well, when we were talking about boundaries, there's one technique I wanted to share there that is very helpful. It straddles that line of being a team player, but setting limits. And it's called the positive no. And basically that means, I'm not able to help you with your initial request, but here's what I can do for you. So you're seeing the person, you're hearing them, but you're offering an alternative that works better for you. You're still being collaborative and helpful, but within your own limits. So you might say, we can't get an entire report to you by this date, but we can have a first draft of half of it. Or I can't get everything to you by Friday, but Wednesday should be doable. And so negotiating, I think, is a skill that comes in with boundaries. And I offer that because it's very helpful, comes in very handy.
Yeah, I love that. And I was thinking, as you were saying that, I was thinking too about when it comes to power differentials, this can be a lot harder. So it's perhaps, even though it may be difficult, it's probably easier for me to set that boundary with my peer than it is with my boss. And I think that that kind of strategy where you come to your manager and you say, almost from a consultative standpoint, right? And I think one of the things that, especially as women, we do is we think, if the resources aren't available, whether that's time, whatever the case may be, that it's a personal failure on my part that this deadline can't be met, as opposed to it being a business problem that we just don't have sufficient resources to solve. And so to be able to go to your manager and say, it's not realistic for us to achieve X by the date that we've established with the resources that we've been given. However, here are two possibilities for how we might do some of it, right? And so I think psychologically, it shows that you're still being cooperative and you still are trying to get to a solution. And you also are showing that you have the expertise, the strategic thinking to evaluate different possibilities, that it's not, sort of an apologetic or panicked no, right? It's a thoughtful response.
Absolutely. You nailed it. I can't tell you how many times women especially will come to me and say, I'm not getting ahead. I'm not advancing because I've been told I don't know how to prioritize, or I was told that they can't give me more responsibility because there's already too much on my plate. And so your point about saying no, when done in the right way, can actually exemplify your leadership skills. It shows people you know how to strategize, problem solve. You have conflict resolution skills. You can communicate effectively. So again, I think changing your mindset around this really informs how you show up in these situations.
Yeah. And then it comes from a place of empowerment, right? As opposed to a place of, I'm not good enough.
Yes.
Oh my gosh, Melody, I could talk to you all day. I love our conversations. So for everybody listening who wants to learn more about you, access your book and all your other great resources, where can they find you?
You can find me at melodywilding.com. If you head to melodywilding.com/book, you can download a free chapter of the book there. I also invite you to connect with me on LinkedIn. Just search Melody Wilding. I have 5 currently LinkedIn learning courses that would be great for you to check out. Lots more tools and strategies there.
And I think, Melody, how I found you is you write a lot of articles too. So I started following your work there. And I'm curious if that's, if there's a way to follow that in a more consistent way for people listening, or, are there certain outlets that you target, or how does that work?
Yeah, I would say I'm most active on HBR, on Harvard Business Review. So I think LinkedIn is probably the best place. I post all of my articles. I share them all on there. But if you search on HBR, you search my name, you'll come up with all of the articles there too.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for all that you do for us. It's wonderful to hear your insights, and so grateful to have a chance to talk to you again.
Well, likewise. Thank you.
Thanks so much for listening to the Impostor Syndrome Files. If you would like to continue this conversation in a safe and trusted space, I would love for you to join my virtual discussion group every Thursday at 12 p.m. Eastern. For the past several years, the group has been limited to women, but it is now open, regardless of gender, to anyone who is interested in exploring and troubleshooting common workplace challenges, building better awareness of ourselves and others, and becoming more inclusive allies at work. Check out the show notes for more info on how to find us, and please join us next week for another episode of the Impostor Syndrome Files.